First tonight, the young Norwich woman allowed to die by medical staff because she asked not to be treated.
26-year-old Kerry Wolterton was taken to the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital after swallowing antifreeze, having already made a so-called living will, requesting that she shouldn't be revived.
A coroner has now concluded that staff had no choice but to comply with the law and respect her wishes. But the case has prompted calls for a change in the law. Malcolm Robertson reports.
For Melanie Miller, it's been a difficult time, the loss of her best friend and the godmother of her 4-year-old son, George. She said she was closer to Kerry Wolterton than anyone else. She'd been aware of her severe depression, that she was unlikely to have children because of a medical complaint, and the threats to kill herself. 2 years ago, Kerry was admitted to the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital after the latest in a series of suicide attempts. She'd drunk antifreeze. She was clutching this letter in which she said she didn't want any life-saving treatment. She was 100% aware of the consequences, and the only reason she'd called an ambulance was because she didn't want to die at home. 26-year-old Kerry from Norwich had signed a living will making clear her final wishes. Today, Melanie Miller told me Kerry had a personality disorder that made her suicidal.
Well, I just knew that one day she would succeed as to what she was trying to do, and that was to take her own life.
And did she talk openly to you about that?
She did, yeah. She shared her diaries with me and stuff. So I was well aware that the time might arise one day. And she tried to take her life many times by antifreeze, because she had actually seen it on Casualty once, that antifreeze would be the end.
At her inquest earlier this week, Coroner William Armstrong said she had the mental capacity and had the right to refuse treatment. But Kerry Wolterton's mother is angry. This afternoon she told me the family was considering civil action. Doctors at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital had treated Kerry before, but were worried that treating her on this occasion, against her wishes, could constitute an assault.
They're very experienced in the accident department because they see all sorts of patients who are mentally disturbed. Three doctors were of the opinion, and various nurses also spoke to her, and everybody was quite clear that she was able to understand her predicament and was making rational decisions.
Melanie Miller still has letters from Kerry in which she talked openly about how miserable she was and how she wanted to die, and there was nothing Melanie could do to dissuade her.
And you've got no doubts that Kerry wanted to kill herself and didn't want the hospital to stop her?
That is what she wanted at the time, and everybody around her had to respect that.
Do you feel she's at peace now with herself?
I do. I went to see her shortly after she died, and she did look at peace.
2 years on, Melanie Miller misses her terribly. She said Kerry loved being godmother to George, but found life just too much of a challenge. Malcolm Robertson, Anglia News, Norwich.
Well, earlier I spoke to Dr Anna Smidor, who's a lecturer in medical ethics at the University of East Anglia. I started by asking her whether doctors really had a choice about leaving Kerry to die.
I don't think they really did. You know, looking at the circumstances of the case, there was a clear advance directive which the patient had completed, obviously with this view in mind. And also she was conscious when she was brought in, and she was able to repeat her wishes verbally. So in the face of all that evidence, I think the doctors really were pretty much forced to behave as they did.
At the inquest, it sounded like it was an incredibly difficult case for the medical staff to deal with, in a way putting even more unnecessary pressure on the medical staff.
I think that's one of the really worrying things about this kind of thing. As I've said, in this case, the patient came in conscious, but if she'd come in perhaps a few minutes later when she'd lost consciousness, there are a whole lot of questions to be asked about whether the medics have an obligation to look for the advance directive, to establish whether the injuries that the patient has suffered are self-inflicted and therefore comply with her advance directive, or perhaps an accident or something that's happened as a result of someone else injuring her. Now, our doctors are not policemen, they're not detectives. It's not their job to do that kind of analysis, and I think that's what's worrying about this situation.
Finally, this legislation for living wills, it was drawn up to deal with cases of people in old age or terminal illness, clearly not in these types of cases. What needs to be reviewed in the future?
I think that's a really difficult question. It's very hard to draw boundaries that would leave out this kind of case. So I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is. I think one thing that we really need to think about is whether we as a society want to provide a legal sanction for self-harm and suicide. And if not, then perhaps we need to revisit this advanced directive legislation and try and clear up some of the loopholes.
Dr. Smidor, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, a couple whose 3-year-old son was killed when he fell from a tractor being driven by his grandfather say they don't blame him for the tragedy.
Corey James was sitting on Chris May's knee when he fell off, suffering head injuries. It happened at Islip in Northamptonshire in June. Today, an inquest concluded that Corey James's death was an accident. Claire McGlasson reports.
They came to sit on Corey's bench. It marks the spot where they witnessed the accident which claimed his life.
We wake up with those memories in the middle of the night quite a lot. Quite a lot they come back to us.
But then we've also got 3.5 years of happy memories.
Beautiful memories.
Corey was like his granddad's shadow, by his side everywhere he went.
So when it was time for Chris Mays to do his regular grass cutting here at Islip Cricket Ground, it was no surprise that Corey wanted to help too. He begged to be allowed to sit on his granddad's knee in the tractor cab, a treat he'd enjoyed several times before.
And as soon as you see the truck pull up, he goes, "Granddad, Granddad, Granddad." You know what I mean? A pair of them were inseparable.
But on the 13th of June, Corey was distracted. He spotted his toy helicopter, which his dad had sent up for a test flight. Wriggling out of his granddad's arms, he jumped out of the tractor and fell onto the machinery.
For 15 minutes, Corey's parents frantically tried to save his life. His dad took off his T-shirt to try and bandage up his son's head until the air ambulance arrived and rushed him to Coventry Hospital.
I wake up every morning and I'm hoping it's going to be a bad dream, and...
At Kettering Coroner's Court this morning, an inquest concluded his death was an accident. Something his parents have always believed. They say it was no one's fault and that his granddad is suffering.
They say there's no way you could blame that man. That man is feeling the same hurt as what we're feeling, his life is as devastated as ours, and basically all we want to do now is just, grieve, as a family now. And he'd come in with this great big, beautiful brown eyes and his hands out, kiss and cuddle now, and he'd just melt you.
£7,000 has already been raised for the air ambulance in Corey's memory, and donations have bought this bench, a place for his family to sit and remember. Claire McGlasson, Anglia News, Islip near Kettering.